Hello, friends. Welcome to Ewaste Watch. Welcome to another panel at Ewaste Watch. Today, our panel is going to be moderated by Robert Crocker from China Australia Center for Sustainable Development. You would also know him as the author of the recent book, Somebody Else's Problem, Consumerism, Sustainability, and Design. This is the second panel that Robert is moderating for us. If you have not watched the first panel, I would really encourage you to go to the video panels menu item and watch the first panel, The Future of Waste. It was very insightful and really good. And today, Robert is interviewing John Gertsakis. He is the director and co-founder of the newly created Ewaste Watch Institute. And a little more notably, he was the author of Australia's first report on e-waste recycling in 1995 that was titled Short-Circuiting Waste from Electronic Products. So I am just going to hand this over to Robert now, who will introduce himself and John further and set more context for today's panel. As usual, please use the live chat box below. Put your questions out there to us. Our panelists will respond to your questions as the panel progresses. So over to you, Robert.
Thank you, Sweta. I think the probably a really good way of starting. Can you hear all right? Yep. Okay. I think a really good way of starting is to consider that what we call e-products, e-waste, are extremely successful today. They're all expanding very rapidly, moving towards the Internet of Things. At the moment, we're throwing away 50 million tons a year, something like that. And this is destined to double. And these products have scarce materials. They take huge amounts of energy to make. They're often used for relatively short periods of time. And in terms of mobile phones, for example, we're probably looking at very short periods of time, given their complexity and their materials. So there's a sort of a business model at work here, which doesn't necessarily bode well for the environment, because we are essentially throwing away things that we will need very soon. Now, John is particularly interesting in this space because he's had a long time involved in this. I've known John for a while, but his background is in policy development, particularly in difficult products like this, but also in packaging and other areas. So, John, do you want to just start by framing the problem? I mean, going beyond what I've said,
Sure.
As a global phenomenon.
Sure. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Sweta. My background, just to expand a little bit more on what Robert has said, has focused on product sustainability, the policy of and the practice of improving the life cycle environmental performance of products. Much of that work began for me at the Centre for Design at the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology during the 90s under the director then, Professor Chris Ryan, where we really started to look closely at the role of product design, industrial design, the design disciplines generally, from a life cycle perspective. And again, this issue of how do we use design as an intervention to improve products and their sustainability performance. My area of focus over those years and subsequently has been on the policy area of extended producer responsibility and product stewardship, and in particular dealing with electronics, and having worked with the consumer electronics companies here in Australia over several years. But to build on what Robert has said, electronics are proliferating. The broadest definition of electrical and electronic goods, including those powered by batteries, is just it's proliferating. And many of these products bring great value, are very functional, provide much entertainment. But they are also contributing to a significant environmental load, a significant environmental impact, which is really not being addressed effectively to date. We see a lot of recycling activity around the world in relation to e-waste, or WEEE, as it's often referred to in parts of the Northern Hemisphere. But clearly, recycling alone hasn't addressed the problem adequately. And there is now a growing acknowledgement, a growing movement towards the need to think differently, to solve problems differently, to begin to transition towards greater circularity and looking at closing loops, solutions that are regenerative and restorative and low carbon, as opposed to simply collecting dead products and recycling them. We need to keep doing that, but clearly the problem requires some significant step change adjustment that looks at circularity.
And so Ewaste Watch Institute, can you perhaps explain your goals, your aim?
Sure.
Yeah, so...
Our Ewaste Watch Institute is a very new organisation. It's a not-for-profit organisation co-founded by myself and my colleague Rose Reed, who developed and ran Australia's mobile muster program for many years here for mobile phone recycling in Australia. What we're wanting to do is essentially accelerate electronic sustainability. So whilst it's dealing with waste, we want to reconfigure thinking around electronics and anything with a plug or a battery, and how we can, again, improve the life cycle environmental performance of these products, but also look at the social dimension, look at the social issues and impacts where they are relevant. But for us, it is about speeding up the process of change, positive solutions. We want to go beyond recycling, and we have 4 key strategy areas. Through our projects, through our research, we're seeking to inform, to educate, to engage, and to activate in that broad space. And whether that's dealing with the design of new products and advocating solutions, doing research on consumer attitudes and behaviour, looking at cleaner production, smart logistics, and increasingly the growing interest in how we extend the life of these products where it makes sense and is safe to do so. And that means much greater attention to reuse, repair, durability, warranties that are sensible and necessary to give consumers more useful information when they're making purchases about more durable products. But as I mentioned, we want to go beyond recycling, and we're guided by 3 questions, in this space. Are we doing enough to address the known issues, the globally acknowledged issues of e-waste? Can we do more? And specifically, what might some of the solutions be? Whether they are in relation to the need for more different types of policies and programs, the need for greater regulatory intervention, or alternative grassroots models around the whole right to repair movement that's in the States and now coming across to Australia. The whole DIY and iFixit movement, empowering consumers to take greater control of these products and processes themselves. So we're looking to resource a range of different stakeholders with positive information based on good science, good research, and to that end, we've partnered with the Institute for Sustainable Futures at the University of Technology, Sydney, with Professor Damien Jerko and Stuart White and their teams to also build out our research program to address these issues.
What about transparency? I mean, this is probably jumping ahead a bit.
No, jump away.
Yeah. If you look at the average phone or the average e-waste product that becomes e-waste, there's almost nothing accessible to the consumer that will tell the consumer what's in it that's dangerous, what kind of impact it will have on the environment or has had in its creation, what kind of impact it'll have at the end of its life. And yet, as we know, these products can give you instant access to a huge amount of information. And I'm just wondering, why have we been so slow in terms of legislation to push, because we push these people to do a lot, the manufacturers to do a lot, but we don't actually push them to inform the consumer about what the consumer's holding in their hands. And you can have a phone in your hand that will tell you anything virtually, but won't tell you where it came from, what it's made from, or where it's going. It's
a very, very good point. It's a very, very good point. It just shows where and how data is being used, how information is being used. And look, to be fair, there are some manufacturers, some brands.
They do try. Yeah, they do try.
Who share their various environmental information on their websites, environmental product declarations.
Yeah.
life cycle assessment summaries of their products. Are they easy to find on websites? Not always. Do they proactively promote these to consumers and policymakers? Sometimes yes, often no. So I think your question is a very good one. These very powerful devices are very well placed to inform and to educate consumers, but we're not seeing the delivery of that information in a straightforward, uncomplicated way that can guide consumers to purchase greener products, environmentally improved products, waste-free products. There are notable examples. If you look at Fairphone from the Netherlands, a wonderful example of transparency, of detailed information, of really providing the consumer with a variety of detail about their product and the system around that product, including the very physical systems for take-back, reuse, recycling, and the embedded design features in that product. They're very, very transparent. So there are examples, but they are in the minority when it comes to these sorts of products. And there are global IT brands and consumer electronics brands that are doing some very good work in sharing environmental information about their products. Is it enough to deal with the problem as we know it today? Clearly not. That's not a matter of opinion. It's a matter of the scale of the problem.
I suppose my point is that if, say, a clothing manufacturer can create a QR code-based system where you're given information about where the product comes from, how to look after it, how to dispose of it, or how to repair it and how to dispose of it, is it totally impossible for to do the same in electronic products? Or is it just that you need different kinds of information and perhaps a different way of presenting that information?
I think there's a need to think very differently about how we inform and educate consumers in relation to these products, whether it's at the procurement and the purchasing end of the transaction, whether it's about at the use and the operation stage of the product, whether it's about it's come to the end of its useful first life, how might we repair it, refurbish it, but also knowing the fundamentals about what's in these products. I think there's been a very tired and lazy approach by many players in terms of how we communicate the environmental performance of products. We can't transform everyday consumers into environmental scientists, nor should we. If people want that information, they'll find it. You shouldn't have to go and find a life cycle assessment in order to understand the impacts of the product. So I suppose what I'm saying is there is great scope for more creative and informative marketing and communications around these products to help avoid waste, reduce waste, reuse. There's a question here, if we can jump to it, from Mendit in Australia. Good to see. About, let me read it out. Also, how increased community engagement with e-waste must be ramped up, i.e. reuse and repair. Consumers who are waste warriors are being shut out. Why? I think it's, part of the answer to that question is around the extent to which program managers, policy makers have engaged with the question of reuse and repair. There's a great deal of investment and effort and programs and funding that's put into recycling, and to a certain degree that's understandable. So I don't think it's an intentional process of shutting out consumers. However, I think the result is that, given the focus on recycling, materials recycling as such, has provided little scope for greater attention to reuse and repair, more funding and grants for reuse and repair projects. So I think, in terms of community-based activity, grassroots activity around reuse and repair, much, much more can be done. And I think that's an area that needs much more attention. I think, things such as the right to repair and iFixit will help grow that profile, and we'll see changes in policy and programs.
Do you think, well, some cynics say, some skeptics, if you like, they say that this focus on recycling is a way of distracting us from the problem of shortened lifespans. I mean, if you went back to the first mobile phones, you expected them to last 3 or 4 years. You didn't expect to get one the next year. So in effect, if you compare a user, say, in 1996 or 98, with a user today, even though the phones are more efficient, probably better for the environment, perhaps, we're using twice as many. The same number of users are using twice as many. And as you were telling me earlier, in Australia, we're putting 23 million into drawers, when we finish with them, so we're not even recycling them. So I guess the e-waste mountain, even though it may not be in one place, is growing all the time.
It is absolutely growing all the time. And look, there are many responses to that point, Robert. On one hand, you can say that whilst there is this sort of sales-driven push to get more product into the market, we're also seeing a lot more product where it's kept going longer through online trading and hand-me-downs and all the rest of it. So there's an upside to some of that in the sense that products aren't necessarily recycled first up. They're reused, they're repaired, they go into informal refurbishment programs, formal refurbishment programs, and they're not ending up in landfill. They're not ending up as an environmental problem. The other side to that is this question of hoarding. And it's a phenomenon that's very clear in Australia and probably in other regions and jurisdictions, where people are holding on to their phones and other IT equipment because of some perceived value, or they're concerned about the data that's on those, or that they may wish to keep an old phone as an emergency backup. But what that means is, in Australia alone, we have 23 million odd phones sitting in drawers at home and in workplaces that are not being refurbished, reused, or recycled. And we need to get those products back. We need to recover those materials and make sure that they go back into the production cycle, or where they can be repaired and refurbished, reused. But there is an issue there. And again, that comes back to communications, in my opinion, as to how reuse and repair and recycling services and options are promoted to consumers. And there's just not enough of that happening in an effective way. There's plenty of campaigns and there's plenty of PR around some of these services. But in terms of its positive impact and effect, in some areas, it's very limited. And again, evidenced by the growing mountain of end-of-life products that are ending up in the wrong place.
Well, what about going to this question, one of the questions from Karen, the Australian Product Stewardship Act. You are in your work, you're very connected to this. Now, this is what you term quite correctly a chapeau or a framework piece of legislation, and the EU has their own equivalent, I think.
Yes, they do.
And America probably would have.
Certain states. No, certain states do. I mean,
states, yeah.
Australia has been the laggard. I mean,
Yeah.
we've had the Product Stewardship Act and the National Television Computer Recycling Scheme here in Australia for the last few years, but clearly the Europeans led the way with the WE directive and the sister directive, the ROHS directive, and various US states, Canadian provinces, Japan have had regulations in place. The TV and computer recycling scheme, whilst has had a few glitches and problems, has been very successful. It's been chiefly industry funded. Local councils participate in the collection and promotion process. But they are only two categories, TVs and computers. And this is the downside. Australia needs to really mimic what's happened with the WE directive, and that is apply to a range of different electrical and electronic product categories, including consumer electronics and cameras, now with photovoltaic panels, scientific and medical equipment, toys, musical, and that's where Australia is lacking. But it's the case in other countries as well. But the Product Stewardship Act in itself is an innovative piece of legislation. It's a clever regulatory instrument that allows expansion and application to other product categories as well. There's a question here about what's happened to the Product Stewardship Act review in Australia, and I'll finish up on that one in Australia. I don't want to overdo too much of the content on Australia, but the Product Stewardship Act review in Australia has taken far too long, and now with the change of government may take even longer. But this process has been potentially a useful opportunity to improve the Act, expanded to other categories of electronics to address e-waste, and also listen to smart ideas from the community and business and local councils and research institutions about how we can be better stewards when it comes to electronics. So the short answer to the Product Stewardship Act review and what's happening is it's, in some respects, it's disappeared down a black hole. And the sooner the Commonwealth here in Australia finishes that report and that review and shares it with the community and with industry and with local government and with state jurisdictions, the sooner we can get on with dealing with the e-waste question. But I'll finish up there on Australian questions because I don't
know. What about, my understanding, one of the fundamental problems here is that the design of these products is often for a year, 2 years use, at the moment. What can we do in terms of the circular economy to incentivize producers to not only take back what they produce and reuse or remanufacture, but to rethink the design so that the parts can be understood as valuable? Because we're coming up against a cliff, a resource cliff, where we've got water issues. Places like Africa, where there's been illegal recycling. In Ghana, there's a question from Ghana, actually. It's very serious, when you have informal sector dismantling of these products with all their toxins going into the soil, going into the water, and these resources are very scarce. And I just, I'm aware that in Australia there are some people interested in microfactories where you're taking because some of the materials are quite valuable. The problem is often the design makes them inaccessible. And I'm wondering if the Product Stewardship Act could be jigged in some way to help push sustainable design.
Look, I'll answer that generally rather than on the Product Stewardship Act. I think,
sure.
It's sometimes dangerous to generate about legislation or regulation. It is a matter of looking at what's the objective and how do we achieve that through various measures. If it can be done on a voluntary basis and it is effective and there is community support for it and we're seeing measurable environmental benefit and social benefit, then voluntary initiatives should proceed and be supported. But where that activity isn't taking place, where manufacturers and industry are dragging their feet, and we're not seeing tangible results, that's where there is a role for regulation. And I think, if policymakers and lawmakers have the objective of better using design, getting better design outcomes that wouldn't otherwise happen through voluntary measures, then that's a matter of creative regulatory development. That's intelligent, smart regulation. So I think there is great scope, Robert, to use regulation, but it requires government officials to think outside the square in terms of the role of regulation.
It's a bit like there's I don't know how true this is, but there's a German kind of myth or story that the way they fixed the Rhine was forcing people who were pumping pollutants into it to have their intake downstream from where their pollutants were going. And it
sounds like a very plausible myth.
But I was thinking, it's almost as though we need to find that sweet spot in regulation.
I would agree. And that is very much, in some respects, it is one of the objectives of policies related to extended producer responsibility.
Yes.
Especially as devised by Thomas Lindquist in Sweden, and the whole idea of, if you require manufacturers to take their products back, they will think differently about how they design them, how they manufacture them, how they manage logistics, how they deal with consumers, how they interact with retailers, etc. And in theory, that remains a really important objective. In reality, extended producer responsibility programs in many product categories have just resulted in industry-funded collection and recycling programs. And that feedback loop back to manufacturers, back to brands, back to OEMs, with the more progressive companies, that's worked. But with many of them, that feedback loop, according to research from the OECD, hasn't been so successful. There are examples in the commercial furniture industry in the United States where that feedback loop through extended producer responsibility has worked. But we're not seeing enough of that information feedback that informs the design of new products so that they are significantly better from an environmental perspective. I've got a question here from Robert. Question for Robert. From Sam in Uganda to Robert. What are some of the promises that we have from the producers, especially on taking responsibility?
I think to some extent we talked a little bit about this, but my sense is that one of the difficulties is this is a very fragmented industry, in that you use your mobile phone, say, or your computer, you give it away or you recycle it, and you don't really know what happens. So there's a break in information that occurs. And one of the things that has always puzzled me is how, even though there's a tremendous amount of value locked up in waste, in e-waste, the manufacturers don't seem to appreciate the value they're losing. It's one of those industries where there seems to be no awareness that they're actually tipping down the drain precious copper, gold, etc. The other people that come along afterwards, that's their business. But really, if they could perhaps be more aware of that, and if legislation could push them to accept that extended producer responsibility, then I think you would start getting progress in this sphere. But while you can make vast profits by just sitting on your hands and letting other people worry about these problems, which is what's happening at the moment, we can't, I don't think, make much progress.
Well, it's a slow process, but nonetheless, it needs to be pursued. There's a related question here from Genevieve, who asked, to what extent should producers be responsible for improving the life cycle of their electronic products? My view is that producers are pivotal in taking greater responsibility, much more responsibility than we're even seeing today. In essence, those players that are beneficiaries from placing a product on the market, be they producers, importers, retailers are often under-discussed, but also consumers all must play a role here. But at the end of the day, consumers don't design those products. So key decisions that are locked in about the environmental performance of a product are locked in by manufacturers. It may require consumers to do the right thing with repair, with reuse, with responsible disposal. But in my opinion, and that evidenced by many key commentators in the space, producers are pivotal, and they have the intellectual ability and tools and strategies and expertise to design great products in this space. So, the answer to that question is, producers need to do much more. Retailers need to do much, much more. But consumers still have a role to play, but manufacturers are key.
Is it possible for governments to insert a price, rather as they've done in say in waste plastic bottles, to say, right, every phone when it's thrown away, or every computer when it's thrown away, is worth $5? Would that help increase the uptake of recycling and reuse, do you think?
Anything is possible, Robert.
Because in South Australia, I know we have, something like 60 or 80, no, is it 80%? Something like that, with plastic bottles are taken up and recycled, largely because of this container deposit scheme. So in a sense, what you're seeing is the government is inserting a value on something which actually has probably as much value to the industry if the industry could get hold of it.
Yes.
But what you're saying is this has value, and therefore you have to pay to,
Look, I think there is a role for some sort of bounty or some sort of return, something that essentially incentivizes the process and incentivizes both producers, retailers, and consumers to make sure that that product doesn't become an environmental problem.
Because there's a broken feedback loop.
There is a broken feedback loop.
And it's not only broken feedback in terms of information, but also in terms of economic value.
No, you're right. You're right.
There's a sort of a severing of economic value.
That sort of model is possible, but it comes down to the willpower of governments and the capacity and interest of lawmakers and government policymakers to experiment with these sorts of ideas. There hasn't been that much in the space of bounties and rebates on manufactured durable products such as electronics. Yes, in packaging, and in some other areas. But I think the broader response to that is we need to value these materials much more effectively. We need to ensure that externalities are costed as part of the process, which is essentially what you're talking about. But we also, more broadly, need to create incentives that generate action in this space. There is another question here from Rebecca. What is the role of circular economy in extending the use of products such as service models, but for consumers rather than business? I think that's a really good question, because often service models are very much in the B2B space. And I do think that there is great scope, especially given the principles, the specific principles around achieving a circular economy in how we deal with products at the consumer level. There are some service examples around. You have Mud Jeans in the Netherlands. You have various nappy wash programs around the world, which are very much a service based model where there are some environmental benefits associated with those processes. So, the answer to that question is I think there is great scope, and it depends in part on, again, the consumer interest, but also government support for these sorts of initiatives, and innovation generally coming out of smart minds in business and within community organisations and other sectoral interests to come up with these ideas. But product service strategies fit very neatly within the circular economy, and it's about dematerialising and using these materials much more efficiently.
I mean, this little pocket Wi-Fi thing, I don't need to throw this out. Perhaps I should show everyone. I don't need to upgrade it because it looks sexy already. I don't need a new one every year. And Vodafone will give me another one if it breaks. So they take it back.
Yes.
So really there's no reason that we don't follow this kind of thing.
No, that's right. So, that's right. And some of it is, there's much to learn from the B2B service models, Rebecca, in the sense that, what Fuji Xerox and many of the other photocopier companies have done for the last 2 decades around leasing imaging machines and copiers, looking at what parts of those business models can be adjusted and modified to meet consumer need. And this comes back to the whole issue. A circular economy is so much more than recycling. Society needs to develop new relationships with products and materials. We need to think about how we consume differently. And that means trying all sorts of new and different strategies, investing and supporting new and different measures. The inordinate investment in recycling at the cost of other product life extension, reuse, repair type models and programs is not right at the moment. There should be lots more investment going into community tool libraries and appliance libraries that really, in a practical sense, play out the sharing economy. So I think there is much that can be done to support very new and very different models that disrupt. I mean, clearly we want to disrupt in a positive way and get good environmental outcomes, make sure that we use materials much more efficiently, get them back, reuse them, think about preventative maintenance, think about the role of the Internet of Things in keeping products going longer.
Can we answer this final question?
Yes.
The last one. And then
question from Karen.
Yes.
Repair of e-waste is considered dangerous by the OEMs. And then there is the issue of security with devices and repair. What are your thoughts? My thoughts are that repair is a really important part of the solution. We need to also be realistic in terms of which sort of products it makes sense for consumers to repair themselves, which sort of products maybe should be dealt with by the original manufacturer, or where there are hybrid versions of that, where manufacturers willingly and proactively support consumers to safely repair products. But I think the current interest in repair by community-based groups is a very, very positive one. And steps by any player to restrict that sort of reuse and repair activity should be scrutinised very closely. We really need to understand why anyone would want to stop DIY repair. And if there's a legitimate reason that comes back to safety, then we should keep that in mind. But as far as your question, Karen, I think we need to see a lot more repair and reuse and refurbishment and remanufacturing, and we need to see that at many levels, and we need to see it move beyond just the alternative lifestylers group. Yes, it's wonderful if it's happening at a small scale. That's where some of the best ideas are seeded and are fertilized and grow. But we will really only see significant environmental benefit when these sorts of approaches are mainstreamed and we have many consumers and the community engaging with them.
Just add to that, I think one of the critical elements in this is design, because if something is stuck together with glues and made really to throw away, made to break, repair can delay its eventual disposal.
Yes.
But it would be even better if the product was designed better for longer use. But to do that, in a way, you need a new business model. Because if you have a business model that depends upon you throwing something away every year, then that is the fundamental problem. Not so much what's inside it, although that is a very big issue as waste.
You're right. And again, it highlights the issue of making sure that we look at some of the root causes associated with the generation of waste. We often see these slogans, which are pretty accurate, around waste is a design flaw, that consumption is the main problem here, and these are areas that aren't being addressed. We often know what some of the technical design-oriented solutions are. We've known what design for disassembly, design for repair, design for refurbishment looks like. We've known that for 10 to 15, 20 years. Those guidelines exist. Some manufacturers use them, but not all. So there is scope with some of the more technical design features to look at how we use incentives to embed those in products more effectively across a range of products. The big challenge is how we get policymakers and brands and retailers looking at how we consume differently, so that there is still commercial gain, but we have what some are calling the whole area of responsible prosperity. How can we still have profitable enterprises, but that they're producing goods that are ethically based, environmentally low impact, circular in their solutions? And I think there are some great examples here to look at in other sectors. I know you can't simply pick up and copy what's happening elsewhere, but many of you may have heard and will know of Patagonia, the outdoor apparel and equipment manufacturer, and a lot of that stems from a fundamental philosophy in how the founders of that company approach products, materiality, durability, repairability, how they worked with iFix, etc., to facilitate these spaces. So, there are some great examples of how to deal with consumption. We're just not doing enough of that across all sectors.
I think also you've got your laptop here on a book on toxicology, and this goes back to your question relating to materials, and one of the issues is that without a proper waste management system where things are taken back and are disassembled and remanufactured or reused in a responsible way, you end up with this huge toxic mountain. And this in a way potentially makes e-waste a much more serious problem than some of the plastics out there, because the plastics out there might strangle and kill animals and fish and birds, but the toxics can last a long, long time and get into the water, into the soil, and poison animals and birds and people over a long, long period of time. And I guess this is something that a couple of the questions have referred to. The safety of e-waste is a big one. And my concern is that with illegal or irresponsible recycling, you're seeing more and more evidence of this from around the world. I was wondering if you had any comments on this, because this must be one of your main
it's one of the key issues, and clearly some of the questions there from Sam as well relate to this issue. My high level quick answer to this is hazardous substances and toxic materials should not be used from the outset. It's as simple as that. These are where there are known toxic substances, hazardous materials. These should not be, in this day and age, in 2019, specified in the production of new goods, if we know that they are potentially problematic either to ecosystems or to human health. Stepping down from that, there is a need to make sure that there are regulations in place that clean up and ensure very rigorous occupational health and safety and other processes around how these goods are disassembled, how the materials are recovered and processed and smelted, and so on and so forth. So there is a great need to ensure effective enforcement and monitoring of recyclers to make sure that there are robust standards and that those standards are applied and audited and work across jurisdictions. So that's important. I think one of Sam's questions around the role of GPS trackers and using those as BAN has been using them quite effectively to track goods and where they are moving, and where they have actually moved to, as opposed to where the recyclers and other recycling programs have claimed they've moved to, is very important. I think there is a great role here in terms of the positive use of technology, the positive use of the Internet of Things, of tracking devices to monitor and help encourage much better, cleaner, greener behaviour amongst all players dealing with electrical and electronic goods. One thing I do want to say in this space, and sometimes, and it depends on what areas you're interested in, is we often think about e-waste and we think about computers, TVs and smartphones. But what we're seeing is an explosion, and the projections are phenomenal around Internet of Things devices and the batteries that will power them and the various network equipment that they will rely on. The other area which is really important, and coming back to Victoria in particular, with some great work being done by Sustainability Victoria, is looking at the stewardship options for photovoltaic systems, solar panels. And again, the projections there are overwhelming in terms of within 10 years, the number of end-of-life solar panels, energy storage, inverters that we're going to see come out of the market that will need processing. So when we're talking e-waste increasingly, and this has been acknowledged in Europe with the WEEE directive, but we need to think about this globally, is e-waste very broadly. Anything with a plug or battery, and much, much more needs to be done with batteries given the widespread uptake of electric vehicles, electric bikes, storage, large-scale, utility-scale batteries. We need to have programs and solutions in place both to deal with the end-of-life product and equipment in this space, but again, making sure that we design, engineer, distribute, transport these devices in a way that is sustainable. It's simply not enough. And I'll say again that evidence has shown us as to where we are today, that recycling alone isn't dealing with the problem. It's an important and essential process as we transition to waste avoidance and a circular economy. Rebranding yesterday's recycling projects as today's circular economy projects is borderline greenwash. So we need to be very careful in that space.
It's borderline.
Karen says, John, how are you, Ewaste Watch, going to rally us all to move forward? I think you've all got wonderful ideas out there in various sectors, from community groups such as yours, Karen, and Mend It, and what's happening in Australia, through to similar repair cafes, the Restart project abroad, the informal recycling sector in India and many other countries. We just need to make sure that these ideas are supported, that key decision makers in government and industry are exposed to these ideas. We need to make sure that we advocate for greater funding and support of these ideas. And that's not an overnight process. We need to do much, much more in that process. But I think the ideas that are out there at the grassroots level, at the community level, with zero waste networks and groups, is significant, and these groups need to really work together even more closely. But there's two words here that I often use in this space that's really important, and that's relentless persistence, and not giving up at all. But I think all of the questions we've had today from various players have been very relevant. Great ideas out there.
I guess, just to take up a couple of the themes in this, take back is critical, obviously. At the moment, there seems to be a problem in that the companies manufacturing things can pass on the take-back responsibilities to a third party.
Correct.
And this seems to me to be a hole in a lot of the legislation. If, say, a manufacturer produces a laptop or a mobile phone or a solar panel, it's very, very soon lost to view, because once it goes in the waste pile, it becomes literally somebody else's problem.
Correct.
And I guess how do we kind of do that German myth of making the outlet?
Yeah. Look, I don't think it's actually that much of a myth. I think it's quite true, and there are some great examples. I think if I was to really simplify it, I think sometimes by collectivizing producer responsibility, we end up with the problem you've just described.
That's right.
We almost need to come back to a state of individual producer responsibility, i.e. the Fairphone method, the Patagonia method, the Fuji Xerox method. By having collective schemes, a lot of information and data can be concealed. The reporting is often very incomplete. The reporting to government is not timely. Government doesn't report it effectively to the community. So there are some real flaws in that collective approach. There are benefits as well, because it keeps costs down, and these programs have to be funded somehow. However, I think the fundamental premise of the individual producer working with their retailer and their consumers to deal with the problem is really quite potent.
And increasing the transparency of the product, because at the moment most consumers have no idea, what's in their hands. I mean, even a coffee cup. I've heard people say, "Oh, the green tinge means it's recyclable."
No.
It's not.
And this is the irony.
And this is a simple product compared to a phone.
This is the irony. Smartphones have effectively become a prosthetic, and they will tell you anything and everything. I can track my friends' flights on jet airliners as they're flying over my house. I can pick where lightning strikes are taking place in the last 15 minutes. I can order food. I can do all sorts of things. Can I find out a detailed bill of materials of the very product that I'm getting this information out of and its environmental impact? I can't. And I think a key step towards achieving a circular economy is access to information, access to data, access to real-time information about the environmental impacts and issues associated with the product. And then consumers can make choices about, well, will I buy brand X or brand Y? And the French have done some very interesting work in terms of laws around warranty periods and small appliances, and required to tell on the package what the designed life is of a kettle or a toaster, and people can choose. Will I get the one with a 10-year warranty or a 5-year warranty that costs more than a 1-year warranty? So this is about, again, good communications beyond the cliched greenwash rhetoric which we tend to see dominate the space.
It's interesting. In Australia, we've got an organisation that looks after gas products, that gives the product stars, environmental stars.
Yep.
We've got another organisation that gives stars for water products, and it's always really struck me that all gas products seem to have 6 or more stars that are new, and I'm very surprised by this. And then I found out from my local carpenter that that's because it's an industry group that put up these stars, whereas the water one is by some government involvement. You can't get away with it.
Yeah.
And I guess what I'm trying to say is that I don't think we can leave it up to Nike to tell us how good Nike products are, because at the moment that's what happens.
I think you're right. No, I think look, there is absolutely a role. Business makes products. They know what's in their products. If the good corporate citizens will share that information, there is a role for independent bodies to ensure and scrutinise that is accurate, it is timely, it is digestible by your average consumer. So there is a role there for both industry and government. I mean, the often cited analogy is: would you let Dracula run the blood bank?
Yes.
No, you wouldn't let Dracula run the blood bank. So there is a need to have high level of integrity around this sort of information,
Yes, that's right.
standards, performance. And I think there are great examples out there of how industry are doing this in a very robust way, but there are gaps. And the gaps still come down to this question of transparency and disclosure. And whilst we hear lots about fancy, glossy annual environmental reports and all the rest of it, there's still not enough that is useful to your everyday consumer.
I think the fundamental economic problem is, as you were saying, the escalation, the way that we're looking at this huge takeoff globally of products with embedded computing.
Yes.
And these products are being introduced all the time. And it's wonderful. You get one that's green and you think, wow, this is fantastic.
Yes.
But then you realize it's replacing all these others that are going to be in the waste stream.
Yes.
And, and then it will be replaced in turn by something even greener.
Yes.
So there'll be more product. This is the Jevons paradox.
Yes.
So I guess
it's a double-edged sword.
Double-edged sword. I just like your comment on that.
Look, I think there will be trial and error. There will be things that we need to try and that will fail. But I think again there is a need for relentless persistence about different models, and we really need to see greater discussion and debate around consumption and the root cause of e-waste. And whether it's through design, whether it's through the sharing economy, whether it's through product service models, whether it's through dematerialisation, whether it's simply about consuming less, there is a need to push the boundaries and move beyond recycling. I think, and again, we're probably going to wrap up shortly. But I think, if I was to leave you all, and without wanting to oversimplify, Vivienne Westwood, fashion designer from the UK, a few years ago came up with a wonderful slogan, which applies to most products and product categories. Whether it is fashion, clothing, apparel, furniture, or electronics. But, if we can all simply buy less, choose well, and then make it last, we will start to have a positive impact on consumption. We will start to slow material cycles. We will start to narrow material cycles, but we will be thinking twice about the need to upgrade, to have the new, etc. And this is not about having a negative impact on the commerciality of these brands. There are plenty of successful brands who are quite ethical. There's just not enough of them, and we need to make it more accessible and cost effective. But I'll say it again, we need to buy less, we need to choose well, and we need to make things last.
I think that brings back what I was saying about transparency, because if the consumer has no way of telling, no way of understanding the impact of the products that they use, there's no basis for the consumer to have judgment. So we saw in Australia that the War on Waste, very popular program, War on Waste, changed apparently over 60% of attitudes of the people who are watching it. This is according to one study. So this is because suddenly people were getting informed about, say, coffee cups or mobile phones or everyday products. Suddenly they were becoming more transparent in terms of their environmental impact. So I guess my concern is you need more transparency. You also need more government involvement.
Correct.
Because at the moment we've got government saying, "Oh, the market will solve the problem."
No, the market
responds.
The market responds. This is not about being anti the market. This is about simply looking at where we're at today in 2019, and the problem is far from solved. So it's not about challenging or scrutinising the market unfairly. It's simply saying we've got the fastest growing waste stream in the world, and the solutions we've been using to date, i.e. recycling alone, more or less, is insufficient. We need to keep recycling, but we need to do a whole lot of other things in tandem with recycling if we are serious about a circular economy. A circular economy requires economy-wide shifts. It needs system change. It needs investment, it needs regulation, it needs education, it needs a different model of thinking across portfolios, sectors, industries, and communities, which demands the obvious, which is it's not about collecting trash and reprocessing it. It's about fundamentally rethinking how we consume, new relationships with products and materials, our lifestyles, access to these goods, and really, I think you're right. It's the market hasn't solved these problems to date, so we just have to be very creative. Relentless persistence, I say to you.
Yeah, I mean, the Jevons issue is a big one because we get better and better at making things. We make them faster.
Correct.
And unfortunately, this means the margins per unit tends to decrease over
Correct.
time.
Yes.
And as the margin decreases, the incentive is there to make more stuff. That's why we need government to intervene and say, well, there's another way of making money here. But in a way, this also requires information for government, but also information for the consumer.
Correct.
Which at the moment is buried in the fine print.
Or very hard to find.
Very hard to find.
Very hard to find. But again, there are some exemplary companies there. There's just not enough of them. But there are some great companies in terms of how information about their products, about their services, is made freely available to consumers. And I think programs such as iFixit and the Right to Repair has brought that to the surface. Product service companies like Mud Jeans, like Fairphone, etc., are also great templates for.
Tell us a bit about Fairphone, because a lot of people wouldn't have heard.
Fairphone is a smartphone company out of the Netherlands. They deal with a number of issues in terms of their product from a sustainability perspective, both environmental and economic and social. It's essentially a fair trade phone, but it's also designed for modularity and repairability and easy parts replacement.
Yes,
and they run a take-back service, and it's all of those eco-design principles that have existed for 2 decades have been embedded and commercialized into this product. But they've also looked at the question of conflict minerals and the materials that go into their product and audit that closely and carefully. So they very much walk the talk. They very much are a template for how many electronic product categories could be approached, I must say. And for any of you that are interested, do have a look at the Fairphone website for greater detailed photos, videos, various blog stories around that product.
So really what you're saying is shame becomes a tremendously useful lever in all this. Because if we could expose what's going on now, and I think to some extent people are doing this, there are NGOs doing this, then the companies who find themselves involved in something shameful, say conflict minerals, they, in a sense, they're then led to consider change.
Yes, you're right.
And that becomes very useful. And also to governments that are thinking about legislation.
Yes.
None of us really want phone dipped in blood.
No, we don't. We don't. No, and I think you use the word shame. I think the way of describing this is is the whole area of competitive spirit. Yes, aimed at responsible prosperity. If we want to, yes, there is the dark outrage sort of perspective on it, but a lot of this is about, an ethical approach to how we conceive, design, make, consume products, all within the context of a circular economy. And I think there's a great need to focus on the specific principles of circular economy. Not get lost in the high-level rhetoric, but look at what is it that a circular economy means in terms of a particular product or a service, and how are we implementing that? The issue of rebranding, recoding yesterday's recycling material substitution projects as today's circular economy is in fact, that is shameful. So there is a need to make sure that there is rigor and robustness when it comes to how we talk about the circular economy. And that won't be easy, and it requires all of us to and the sharpest minds elsewhere to develop solutions and apply them.
Thank you. Thanks so much, John.
Thank you, Robert.
I really appreciate your company in this. And thank you,
Svetlana. And thank you very much to everyone that tuned in and the fantastic questions that have come through. They've been challenging. Sorry, not necessarily having answers to all of them, but wonderful to have you all participate. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, John. I mean, like we did discuss initially as well, you answered like an extensive set of questions, and this is absolutely a great webinar. We've had very good feedback from the audience as well, who are pretty happy with the webinar as a whole. And thanks to both of you. Thanks to the audience as well. It's always great to have people participating when we have a live webinar. And before you go, let me just remind you that next week we have a panel that is going to be moderated by Adam Reed, and it is going to be on marine plastic pollution. Please, you can go to our website and sign up for that one as well. And we'll keep you updated on what is the next panel that Robert is going to moderate for us, which will probably happen in another couple of months. So thanks to both of you.
I've been to China.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Have a good day.
Bye for now.
Thank you. Thanks.
Bye.